My father always swore my linguistics degree was a one-way ticket to a minimum wage life. For a decade, I swallowed his bitter sneers while secretly intercepting nuclear chatter for naval intelligence. He thought I was a glorified receptionist. Then, a 4-star admiral walked up to our dinner table. If you asked my father, Richard Henderson, what his daughter did for a living, he would sigh, swirl his scotch, and say, "Chloe translates things for the government. Mostly paperwork." A waste of a brilliant mind, really. He was a man who measured human worth in stock portfolios, luxury vehicles, and corner offices. To him, success was loud. It was tangible. My older brother David was a corporate acquisitions lawyer in Manhattan, making mid-six figures by the time he was 28. David was the golden child, the benchmark of the Henderson family legacy. I, on the other hand, was the tragic disappointment. I had spent my 20s locked in libraries and language labs, obsessively mastering dialect after dialect. While David was out networking at country clubs, I was burying myself in the syntactic structures of Farsi, Pashto, Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, Korean, and 7 other languages. By the time I was 26, I spoke 13 languages fluently, complete with regional dialects that could fool native speakers. But in my father's eyes, I had spent years acquiring a useless party trick. "What's the end game here, Chloe?" He had asked me during one particularly brutal Thanksgiving dinner. He carved the turkey with the aggressive precision he used in boardroom negotiations. "Are you going to be a tour guide at the UN? Teach high school Spanish? 13 languages, and you don't have a single marketable skill." "I work for the Navy, Dad," I replied, my voice steady, though my hands shook under the table. "I'm an intelligence analyst." He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Right, a desk clerk. David just closed a $40 million merger, and my daughter is formatting translated emails for bureaucrats." I didn't defend myself. I couldn't. What my father didn't know, what he could never know, was that my desk job required a top-secret, sensitive compartmented information, TS, clearance. I wasn't translating emails. I was stationed in a subterranean windowless room at Fort Meade, wearing a heavy headset, listening to the intercepted radio communications of high-value targets. I was the one who realized a Chechen warlord was using a highly obscure regional slang to coordinate arms shipments. I was the one who broke down the linguistic nuances of a Chinese naval commander's drunken boast to pinpoint a stealth submarine's location in the South China Sea. In the military intelligence community, I wasn't just Chloe Henderson. I was one of the most lethal assets the Navy had in its signals intelligence arsenal. My brain was a weapon, capable of processing and analyzing real-time threat data faster than any AI algorithm they had tested. My commanding officer, Captain Thomas Brooks, had once told me that my ear for dialectal micro-expressions had saved at least 400 American lives in a single deployment. But at the Henderson dinner table, I was just a failure. The psychological toll of living a double life began to wear on me. The dramatic irony of being highly respected by generals and admirals, only to be treated like a naive child by my own father, was a heavy burden. I couldn't tell him about the nights I stayed awake trembling, the sound of a foreign operative's dying breath echoing in my ears from a live intercept. I couldn't explain the crushing weight of knowing that if I mistranslated a single modifier in an intercepted terrorist directive, a building would explode. I just had to sit there and let him mock me. "You know, it's not too late to go back to school," Richard said, taking a sip of his Macallan 18. "David's firm is always looking for paralegals. It's a foot in the door. You could finally make something of yourself." My sister-in-law, Sarah, gave me a pitying look across the table. "She's doing just fine, Richard. Let her be." "I just want her to reach her potential," he shot back, slamming his glass down just hard enough to make a point. I didn't pay for an Ivy League education so my daughter could be a glorified secretary for the military. I looked down at my plate. I had just returned from a grueling 72-hour shift where my team had thwarted a synchronized cyber attack by decoding a series of encrypted Russian commands hidden in plain text. I was exhausted, running on black coffee and adrenaline. "I'm happy where I am, Dad," I whispered. He scoffed. "Happiness doesn't pay the mortgage, Chloe. One day, You'll realize the real world doesn't care how many ways you can say hello. I didn't argue. I just silently counted to 10 in Pashto, reminding myself of who I really was. But the resentment festered. A dark, dramatic storm was brewing inside me, a desperate desire for him to see the truth. I didn't want his money, and I didn't want his lifestyle. I just wanted my father to look at me with a fraction of the respect he reserved for my brother. I just didn't realize that my wish was about to be granted in the most terrifying, explosive way possible. The invitation arrived a month later, stamped with the golden seal of the Department of the Navy. It was for the annual Joint Forces Intelligence Commendation Gala, held at a highly secure luxury hotel in Washington, D.C. It was an event strictly for high-ranking officers, elite operatives, and a select few civilian contractors. I was being awarded a commendation. Because of the classified nature of my work, the citation wouldn't explicitly state what I had done. It would vaguely reference outstanding analytical contributions to national security, but the people in the room would know. Guests were allowed a +1, but Captain Brooks, knowing my family situation, pulled some strings to get me a table for 4. I invited my father, David, and Sarah. When I handed my father the thick, cream-colored envelope, he inspected it like it was a counterfeit bill. "A gala?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is this a fundraiser for the typing pool?" "It's an awards dinner," I said evenly. "I'm receiving a commendation." David clapped me on the shoulder. "Good for you, Chloe. Probably an attendance award, right?" He laughed at his own joke. "Will there be an open bar?" my father asked. "If I'm going to spend my Saturday night surrounded by government bureaucrats, I'm going to need a stiff drink." "Yes, Dad. Open bar." The night of the gala, the tension was palpable from the moment we arrived at the venue. The security perimeter was intense. Heavily armed military police stood at the entrances, and Secret Service agents roamed the lobby. Guests were required to surrender their phones and pass through biometric scanners. My father was immediately irritated. "Do you know who I am?" He barked at a stern-faced Marine corporal at the metal detector. "I own half the commercial real estate in this zip code. I don't have time for this TSA nonsense." "Step through the scanner, sir," the Marine said, his voice devoid of emotion, entirely unimpressed by Richard Henderson's net worth. I flashed my ID badge at the security chief. The chief's eyes flicked to my name, and his entire demeanor shifted. He snapped to attention, giving me a sharp, respectful nod. "Ma'am, welcome. Your party is cleared." My father didn't notice the exchange. He was too busy adjusting his bespoke tuxedo and complaining about the draft in the hallway. We entered the grand ballroom, and for a moment, even my father was silenced. It was a sea of dress uniforms, sparkling medals, and quiet authority. Generals, admirals, and defense officials mingled under the crystal chandeliers. The air buzzed with low, intense conversations. This wasn't a corporate networking event. This was a room full of people who controlled the geopolitical fate of the world. We found our table near the front. My father immediately flagged down a waiter to demand a specific vintage of Bordeaux, completely ignoring the fact that a 2-star Army general was sitting at the table next to us. "Interesting crowd," David noted, looking around. "A lot of brass. How exactly did a desk clerk get invited to the front row, Chloe?" "Luck of the draw," I lied, taking a sip of water. Throughout the first course, my father held court, loudly discussing his latest real estate conquest, seemingly oblivious to the annoyed glances from the surrounding tables. I sank lower in my chair, praying the evening would go smoothly. But the atmosphere in the room began to shift right before the main course was served. It started subtly. I noticed Captain Brooks walking briskly across the far side of the room, his phone pressed to his ear, a massive security violation unless it was a highly encrypted secure line. He looked pale. Then, a group of 3 naval aides fast walked up to a table at the very front and leaned down to whisper frantically into the ears of several high-ranking officers. My trained eyes caught the micro-expressions of panic. Something was wrong. Something major. "Look at these people," my father sneered, cutting into his steak. "All dressed up, pretending they're important. I bet half of them have never worked a real day in their lives. The private sector is where real decisions are made." "Dad, keep your voice down," Sarah hissed nervously. Why? Because Chloe's boss might hear me? Richard scoffed. Please, what are they going to do, audit my emails? Suddenly, the ballroom doors swung open, and the low murmur of the crowd abruptly died. Admiral James T. Caldwell, the commander of U.S. Fleet Cyber Command and one of the most feared and respected men in the armed forces, strode into the room. He wasn't scheduled to be here. He was supposed to be at the Pentagon. He was flanked by 4 armed security details and 2 frantic-looking intelligence officers clutching classified tablets. The room went so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Every service member in the room stood at attention. "Sit down," Caldwell barked, his voice echoing like thunder. He didn't walk to the podium. He didn't address the crowd. His sharp, predatory eyes scanned the ballroom, bypassing the generals, the politicians, and the defense contractors. He was looking for someone specific. "What's going on?" David whispered, looking genuinely unnerved. "Probably some bureaucratic grandstanding," my father muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. Caldwell's eyes locked onto our table. He began walking straight toward us, his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The security detail followed closely. As he approached, the officers at the neighboring tables scrambled to get out of his way. My father puffed out his chest, assuming, in his supreme arrogance, that the Admiral was coming to greet him. Richard stood up, smoothing his tie, a confident, practiced smile spreading across his face. He extended a hand. "Admiral, Richard Henderson, it's an honor. I'm a significant contributor to the Kremlin." Admiral Caldwell didn't even look at my father. He walked right past Richard's outstretched hand, entirely ignoring his existence, and stopped dead in front of my chair. The Admiral's face was grim, etched with a level of stress I had only seen during active wartime operations. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on our dining table, and looked me dead in the eyes. When he spoke, his voice was a low, terrifying rumble that carried across the dead silent room. "We have a situation in the Strait of Hormuz," Admiral Caldwell said, his tone urgent and devoid of pleasantries. "We just intercepted a raw, scrambled audio broadcast from an unregistered submersible. The algorithms are failing. We have 15 minutes before a carrier strike group sails directly into what we think is a coordinated trap." My father stared at the Admiral, his mouth hanging open in utter confusion. He looked from Caldwell to me, as if waiting for someone to deliver the punchline to a very elaborate joke. Caldwell didn't break eye contact with me. He pulled a heavy, encrypted sat phone from his jacket and placed it on the table next to my plate. "I don't care about your dinner, and I don't care about this gala," the Admiral said, his voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "I need my best ear on this right now." "Tell me what they're saying, Nightingale." My father froze. The glass of Bordeaux slipped from his hand, shattering violently against the floor. The sound of the shattering crystal wine glass seemed to echo in the dead silence of the ballroom. A dark red stain of vintage Bordeaux began to seep into the pristine white tablecloth, dripping onto my father's expensive leather shoes. For the first time in my entire life, Richard Henderson was completely, utterly speechless. He stared at the encrypted sat phone sitting next to my bread plate as if it were a live hand grenade. I didn't look at him. I couldn't afford to. The moment Admiral Caldwell said 15 minutes, the gala, my family, and my father's decades of relentless belittlement ceased to exist. I was no longer Chloe Henderson, the disappointment. I was Nightingale. I picked up the heavy, black device. The casing was thick, designed to withstand a bomb blast, and the screen glowed with an eerie green tactical interface. I pulled the attached earpiece from its port and pressed it into my right ear, tapping the screen to initiate the playback of the raw intercept. "Give me the context, sir," I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly into the cold, clinical cadence I used in the subterranean vaults of Fort Meade. "USS John C. Stennis Strike Group is transiting the strait," Admiral Caldwell replied, leaning over the table, his massive shoulders blocking out the ambient light of the chandeliers. His 2 intelligence aides flanked him, tablets glowing. 10 minutes ago, a P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft caught a burst transmission from a submerged contact moving at 20 knots. "It's not one of ours," and it's not matching any standard Iranian or Russian acoustic signatures. The AI translators are throwing back gibberish. They think it's a localized code. We are blind, Nightingale. If it's an ambush, the Stennis is sailing right into the kill box. Play it again, I ordered the aide to my left. He tapped his tablet, and the audio looped. I closed my eyes, shutting out the glaring lights of the ballroom and the stunned, pale faces of my brother and sister-in-law. I focused entirely on the chaotic noise flooding my eardrum. It was a nightmare of an intercept. The audio was buried under layers of heavy static, the rhythmic, throbbing cavitation of diesel engines, and the rushing sound of deep water. But beneath the acoustic garbage, there was a voice. It was panicked, speaking rapidly, barking coordinates and status updates. شبكة السيد جاهزة. المنطقة الحمراء. ثلاثة. اثنين. My brain instantly processed the Arabic baseline. The fishing net is ready. Red zone. 3, 2. But it wasn't just standard Arabic. The phonetic structure was warped, the consonants softened in a very specific, isolated way. The AI had failed because the speaker wasn't using a military lexicon. He was using Kumzari, a highly obscure, dying language spoken by a few thousand people on the Musandam Peninsula, heavily mixed with Omani smuggling slang and Russian naval loanwords. It was a linguistic fingerprint that no machine learning model had enough data to decode. But I did. I had spent 6 months living in an acoustic simulation, studying the communications of stateless mercenaries, operating in the Gulf of Oman. I have it, I said, my eyes snapping open. I grabbed a pen from David's tuxedo pocket, ignoring his flinch, and began scribbling rapidly on a linen napkin. Talk to me, Caldwell demanded. It's not a state-sponsored sub. It's a mercenary fast-attack submersible. They are using Kumzari dialect interwoven with cartel smuggling codes to bypass our algorithms, I said rapidly, translating the frantic voice in my ear in real time. He's confirming deployment of autonomous acoustic mines. They aren't targeting the Stennis directly. They are targeting the escort destroyers. I listened harder, pressing the earpiece deeper into my canal. A string of numbers cut through the static. Grid reference, I barked, writing furiously on the napkin. 26.19 north, 56.25 east. They've laid a bottleneck minefield. The submersible is acting as a lure, broadcasting a heavy acoustic signature to draw the destroyers off the carrier's flank. Once the escorts engage the sub, they sail right into the fishing net. Caldwell's face turned the color of ash. The coordinates I had just given him were exactly where the strike group was heading. Time to intercept? Caldwell asked his aide, his voice dangerously low. 7 minutes, sir, the aide replied, sweat beading on his forehead. Caldwell snatched the sat phone from the table, practically ripping the earpiece cord out of my hand. He hit a red button on the side of the device, connecting directly to the bridge of the USS Stennis. Actual, this is PAC FLT Commander, Caldwell roared into the receiver, completely disregarding the hundreds of people in the ballroom who were now watching him in terrified silence. Execute immediate evasive maneuver. Hard to port, bearing 090. Abort pursuit of the submerged contact. I say again, abort pursuit. You are steering into an autonomous minefield. Confirm. The silence at our table was suffocating. My father sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, a piece of perfectly cooked filet mignon still resting on his fork. Forgotten. David looked like he was going to be sick, and Sarah was gripping the edge of the table so hard, her knuckles were white. For agonizing seconds, we waited. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the Admiral. Then, a faint, tinny voice crackled through the sat phone's external speaker. PAC FLT. This is actual. Hard to port, bearing 090. Evasive maneuvers executed. We are altering course. Caldwell closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The tension in his massive frame dissipated slightly. He looked at the aide holding the tablet. Status on the escorts? Course corrected, sir. They missed the grid by less than 2 nautical miles. They are clear. Scramble the Omani coastal patrols, Caldwell ordered. Give them the coordinates of that minefield. I want it swept and neutralized before sunrise. Yes, sir. Admiral Caldwell slowly lowered the phone. He turned his gaze back to me. The ferocious, terrifying warlord demeanor vanished, replaced by a profound, grounding respect. He didn't smile, admirals like him rarely did, but his eyes were warm. "Good ear, Nightingale," Caldwell said quietly. "You just saved 5,000 American sailors and a $4 billion aircraft carrier. Your country owes you a debt." "Just doing my job, sir," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Caldwell finally looked away from me and noticed my father for the first time. Richard was trembling slightly, his eyes darting between the shattered glass on the floor and the four-star Admiral looming over his dinner plate. "You must be the father," Caldwell said, his voice flat. Yes. "Richard Henderson," my father stammered, his usual booming baritone reduced to a reedy whisper. "Mr. Henderson," Caldwell said, leaning down slightly so they were eye to eye. "I don't know what you do for a living, and frankly, I don't care. But I suggest you spend the rest of your life thanking God that your daughter doesn't do it with you. Have a good evening." With that, Admiral Caldwell turned on his heel and marched out of the ballroom, his security detail and aides trailing close behind. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, and the room descended into a chaotic murmur of whispers and shocked gasps. I calmly picked up my napkin, dabbed my mouth, and reached for my water glass. "So," I said, looking across the table at my brother, "how did that $40 million merger go, David?" The rest of the gala was a blur of surreal juxtaposition. 30 minutes after I had helped avert a major naval disaster in the Middle East, a Navy band struck up a light jazz tune, and waiters in white gloves arrived to sweep up my father's shattered wine glass. No one at our table spoke for a full 10 minutes. My father stared blankly at the wall, his face pale and slack. The aura of invincibility, the arrogant certainty that had defined him for my entire life, had been completely dismantled in less than a quarter of an hour. When the awards portion of the evening finally began, Captain Brooks took the stage. As he read my commendation, he couldn't mention the events that had just transpired. Instead, he spoke of my unparalleled linguistic agility, my dedication to the silent war, and my pivotal role in securing the safety of frontline operators. When they called my name, the applause was thunderous. As I walked to the stage in my emerald evening gown, I saw several generals and high-ranking intelligence officers stand up, giving me a standing ovation. They didn't know the specifics of my missions, but they knew the moniker Nightingale. They knew what it meant. I accepted the heavy glass plaque, shook Captain Brooks's hand, and smiled for the official photographer. I didn't look at my family's table. I didn't need to see my father's face to know he was watching his worldview collapse. The real reckoning didn't happen until the car ride home. David and Sarah had taken a separate Uber, leaving me alone in the back of my father's chauffeured Mercedes Maybach. The city lights of Washington, D.C. streaked past the tinted windows. The silence in the cabin was dense and suffocating. Finally, my father cleared his throat. He sounded older, smaller. "Chloe," he started, his voice cracking slightly. Why didn't you tell me?" I turned my head to look at him. He wasn't glaring at me. He wasn't smirking. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. Apprehension. "Tell you what, Dad," I asked calmly. "That I have a top-secret clearance? That's a federal crime." "You let me sit there," he said, shaking his head, a defensive edge creeping back into his tone. "For years. You let me sit at Thanksgiving and Christmas and talk to you like you were nothing, like you were just some secretary." "No, Dad," I corrected him, my voice turning to ice. "I didn't let you do anything. You chose to do that. You chose to measure my worth by your own shallow metrics. You didn't care about what I actually did. You only cared about how it sounded at the country club. Intelligence analyst wasn't prestigious enough for Richard Henderson." He bristled, his corporate instincts kicking in. "I was trying to motivate you. I wanted you to be successful. Do you know how humiliating it is to have a daughter who—" "Humiliating?" I cut him off, leaning forward, closing the distance between us. The anger I had swallowed for a decade finally erupted, not in a scream, but in a cold, lethal whisper. "You think you were humiliated tonight? You think watching an admiral ignore you is a tragedy? Try listening to a 19-year-old Marine bleed out over a radio while you desperately try to translate the location of the sniper pinning him down. Try waking up in cold sweats because you aren't sure if you misinterpreted a verb tense that got an entire extraction team killed. My father shrank back against the leather seat, his eyes wide. You don't know the first thing about success, Dad, I continued, unyielding. Your success is built on foreclosing properties and hostile takeovers. My success is the reason those ships in the Strait of Hormuz aren't burning wreckage right now. My success is the reason thousands of families won't be getting folded flags handed to them by chaplains tomorrow morning. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked down at his hands, realizing for the first time in his life that there was a world operating above him, a world of life and death, of terrifying stakes, where his money and his real estate meant absolutely nothing. You asked me what the end game was, I said, leaning back into my seat and looking out the window at the passing monuments. There is no end game, Dad. I don't do this for a corner office. I do it because I'm the only one in the world who can. You can keep your stock portfolios and your luxury cars. I have all the respect I will ever need. We didn't speak for the rest of the ride. When the car pulled up to my apartment building, I didn't wait for the driver to open my door. I gathered my purse and my glass commendation plaque. "Good night, Dad," I said, stepping out onto the pavement. "Chloe, wait!" he called out, his voice desperate. I paused, looking back at him through the open door. I'm proud of you," he choked out, the words sounding foreign and clumsy on his tongue. I looked at the man who had tormented me, mocked me, and underestimated me for my entire adult life. I felt no triumph. I felt no vindication. I just felt exhausted. "I know you are," I replied softly, "but it doesn't matter anymore." I shut the heavy door of the Maybach and walked into my building, leaving Richard Henderson alone in the dark. I had a 0600 briefing at Fort Meade the next morning, and the Nightingale needed her rest. And that is how a 10-year double life finally exploded at a fancy Washington gala. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't an argument. It's simply letting your reality shatter their ignorance. If you loved the intense showdown and the dramatic twist in this story, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that real power doesn't always wear a suit. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, real-life military drama stories. Stay vigilant, everyone.